wakey.
Wake the fuck up!
I'm not sure what's going on, but we better check things out.
Oh shit. Here we go again.
I did nothing wrong. I did everything correct.
C5. Yeah, I mean that
Fucking Harry Potter. Pussy smells like every fucking match you get.
Oh my god, I'm stuck against
Any enemy you want. My raid.
Okay, no, wait. We'll use the power of friendship.
Yet another Souls-like has come and went, and after 2 years, Lies of P returns, the Souls-like where you play as Pinocchio. But in this game, every time you lie, instead of your nose getting longer, your heart gets bigger, most likely because the developers didn't want Pinocchio looking like a New York Jew by the end of the game. And it's here with its first and most likely only expansion called Overture, or as I like to call it, as put in the title, Overtuned, which will be the theme of this overall review, because I feel like if you could describe this DLC in exactly one word, it would be just that. And I feel like this is also becoming a problem with the genre as well, with Shadow of the Erdtree being another good example of this. And while that won't be the overall focus of this review, it is something I'll be talking about. And while that definitely doesn't mean the DLC is dog shit or anything like that, I definitely didn't enjoy it as much as the base game. And I feel like a lot of the difficulty in this DLC comes from less of a fair challenge like in the base game, and more so just from a pattern of trial and error. And I definitely don't think it's worth $30 fucking dollars. Nor do I think it even has enough content to justify it costing half as much as the fucking base game, especially when compared to other $30 DLCs. And while there are definitely things I liked, I definitely felt like the cons heavily weighed down my goddamn enjoyment, and I really hope it's not an indicator of what this game's sequel is going to be like. And since I'm going to try to make this a quicker and more to the point review, since this is just for a DLC and there's really not much story to talk about, I think it'll be good to first start with the level design, because this is an example of something that I didn't think was awful, but was definitely a downgrade from the base game, and really left a lot to be desired, along with just the world design in general, because again, I think that's something the base game did really fucking well at multiple different parts, only for you to basically spend the entire goddamn time in the zoo in the fucking DLC. And while you do go throughout several parts of this zoo, including underground, it felt like such a wasted opportunity. So without wasting any more time, the level design. So the reason I want to start with the level and world design is because I feel like that's something the base game actually did pretty damn well, especially out of the many Souls-likes out there. And it's also one of the reasons I feel like Lies of P tends to stand out a bit higher among a lot of the others. And its whole steampunk aesthetic reminds me a lot of Bloodborne in a lot of ways, with its grimy city design and monstrous enemies, not to mention the game's Bloodborne mechanics such as the rally system or the slide instead of dodge. And in regards to the level design, and the world did quite a good job of keeping me interested throughout the game, as you go to quite a few different places, varying from a worn down city, to a subway system, to a junkyard, to a castle, to a museum, and it constantly keeps things fresh and interesting. Top that off with some pretty well designed levels, offering many shortcuts to make everything connect. Not quite as good as something like Dark Souls 1, but I mean, let's be real, what Souls-like does have level design as good as Dark Souls 1, and a lot of different traps scattered throughout the level, making it more difficult to traverse. Again, just like Dark Souls 1, where getting to the boss was often just as big of a challenge as the boss itself. Especially when, if you compare Dark Souls 1 to a lot of the newer Souls-like games, the bosses are quite basic in comparison, and that is definitely not a bad thing. There is a reason why Dark Souls 1 is still considered the best to many people out there, and the reason I feel like it's pretty fucking important for me to get my praise for that out of the way is because when you compare it to the DLC made by the same developers for $30, it is such a fucking downgrade in comparison, and I didn't find traversing through it to be near as interesting as I did the base game. And there's only really a couple standout points which I'm going to talk about. But you basically start off in a generic snowy forest, make your way to a zoo, which I'd say is probably the best part of the DLC, but again is also a big missed opportunity due to the enemy variety, which I'll talk about in the gameplay section, where you'll then spend most of the game then going to the underground section of the zoo, which then leads to a pretty boring generic cave system, which eventually leads you to a carnival, which is probably the most standout part of the game in terms of level design, and that's about it. I definitely wasn't expecting the same amount of variety as the base game, given that it's obviously not as big as the base game, but you could have at least made the more limited selection we did have more special, because really only like 2 out of the 5 areas you spend any time in are actually interesting, and the others are generic as fuck. I mean, really, just some underground tunnel system and a cave system with really nothing standoutish about it. I will say that at least the underground section does have one of the best parts in regards to difficulty of traversal, along with a pretty decent boss, but in terms of it actually being visually interesting, it's definitely not. And I also felt like the actual design itself was quite a big downgrade from the base game, because whereas the base game offered you quite a few different optional paths, which would often loop back to the main path, making them not much of a hassle to go out of your way, often leading to cool secret loot that would actually make you feel rewarded for exploring the more linear levels, and felt pretty satisfying to do. Whereas in the DLC, there really aren't that many optional paths, and the ones that are there are for the most part just, oh, make a left here instead of a right, only to lead you to a fucking dead end with a loot pickup just floating there, then forcing you to turn your ass back around and go where you came from. There's also a lot of backtracking, and what I mean in this case is like you'll enter a section only to see a door blocking your way as soon as you get in, leading to a switch or something to open the main door, again forcing you to run all the way back to where you came from to go through the initial door. And that's not interesting at all, man. The only 2 real standout parts that I can think of was one in the underground tunnel area where you have to make your way down by falling on different ledges and using certain ladders, all while having to avoid enemies and frozen mist. It was a lot like in Elden Ring, how to get the frenzied ending. You have to try to make your way down that goddamn fucking ledge system without falling off, except a lot less fucking annoying this time around. Although that didn't quite stop me from being retarded quite a few times.
Just
One who started.
But despite me fucking up here multiple times, I still found it pretty fun, because it was both a little bit of a challenge to get through, and actually required me to think a little bit instead of just running in a straight line like the majority of this goddamn DLC. And the other would be the carnival area, and that's purely because there's multiple different mini games you can do throughout the area that'll give you rewards if you do successfully. And I gotta say that was obviously the most standout part of the DLC, because it's really the only part that actually gives you an alternative objective or something else to do other than follow the obviously straight path. But I gotta say, considering that this DLC was made by the same people that made the base game, at least as far as I know, it was quite the goddamn disappointment by the time I finished it, because I just kept expecting a more interesting area to appear, but sure enough, I eventually got to the final boss and knew from that point on that we were not getting that. And you can't even use the fact that it's shorter as a good excuse, because some of the most interesting Dark Souls areas were the DLCs, and even in those smaller DLCs, they still managed to squeeze in a pretty damn good amount of variety into some of them, and it really lacked the whole Bloodborne feel on top of that the base game had, outside of maybe the final boss. But I just wanted to quickly get that out of the way, because outside of a couple other things, that was probably my personal biggest disappointment about the DLC, given that I thought it was one of the biggest pros of the base game. But with that out of the way, I think it's about time I talk about the enemy variety, additions to gameplay, you know, the shit you're actually going to be spending the majority of your time doing, because there's definitely both some good and some bad. So I guess I'll just quickly start off with the pros, because it's Really not that many. But if there's one pro this DLC does have for sure, it's the new weapons. And while I definitely do wish there were more, there were two in particular that I really liked. Probably more than anything in the base game. And that's of course the gun sword, which looks like it was ripped straight from Final Fantasy VIII, which I have absolutely no problems with, as I've always liked Final Fantasy VIII, and I've always thought the gun sword was just a cool concept, even if it is pretty impractical. With a damn near perfect moveset to match. That really is a lot of fun to use. And the other one being the pinwheel sword. Because, I mean, come on, it's a pinwheel sword. Better than having a good moveset, which is pretty damn fast for a heavy weapon. The pinwheels also spin as you swing, doing additional hits, and I just thought that was pretty fucking cool. And it genuinely felt better to use than any of the clunky ass base game heavies, not taking into account the modified handles. There's also a third sword you get that's honestly really overpowered and is really fun to use, but you don't get it till quite literally the very end of the DLC, so you won't really be able to use it for any of the DLC unless you do a New Game Plus playthrough, which I probably won't be doing for the reasons I'll be mentioning in this video. But nonetheless, I figured I should mention it since it basically has the best special attacks in the entire game, with one of them pretty much just being Virgil's Judgment Cut.
You shall die.
And the only other pro I feel like I could really give for this wallet rape of an expansion would have to be for a couple of its bosses, but I'm going to give them their own section directly after this, so I'll just mention them there. And sure enough, some of the other bosses are definitely a fucking con of this DLC, with one of them in particular being a prime example of why I'm starting to get fucking burnt out of Souls-likes, and why I'm really hoping Ninja Gaiden 4 isn't a piece of dog shit, because much like Battle Royale, Souls-likes have been used and abused more than iDubbbz's asshole, and Anissa is unrelenting.
If you can. I just want to ask him if you've always been shitting your pants.
No.
But before she can do that, she has to take a picture of her pussy for OnlyFans.
You're a whore. You whore yourself out online. You whore yourself out in front of your family and your friends. You're a whore, plain and simple.
But the next thing I want to talk about is enemy variety. And not just where there are a lot of missed opportunities, but some of it just felt lazy as fuck, because there were so many repeat enemies from the base game, or just slight reskins. Hell, the only optional boss in the game is actually a younger version of a boss from the main game, and arguably the worst or second worst one at that. And I'm like, kid, whoever the fuck chose this boss out of all the fucking bosses to bring back for the DLC needs to be given the Lenny special, taken out back, told to look over the white picket fence and think of the rabbits.
And I get the tender rabbit.
So like I was just saying, I think enemy variety and new enemy types is one of the biggest missed opportunities in this goddamn game. Especially when I heard that this DLC was going to be taking place in a zoo. One of the first things that came to my mind was, oh, I bet that means there will be a bunch of cool new enemy types. And while there are a handful, there are not nearly as many as I was expecting. Especially when you take into account that most of these animals have been mutated by this disease. There were so many missed opportunities. And one of the enemy types you'll be fighting the most are fucking angry, finted up gorillas.
Whose mother was brutally shot by a farmer, often show human-like vulnerability.
Which are annoying as fuck to fight, by the way, due to just how many hits they can take and how fucking aggressive they are. But if I wanted to spend the majority of my time fighting shit-flinging chips, then I would just fly my ass down to Detroit, not spend $30 on this fucking DLC. And outside of the fucking gorillas, there's also some mutated elephants, which are pretty cool, and can basically rip their heads off to do long-ranged attacks. But outside of that, there's only really kangaroos and then the first major boss. And you might hear kangaroos and go, oh, that's pretty cool, but you legit only see them in like 2 fucking areas in the entire DLC. I was almost wondering what the point of even making this enemy type was, considering just how little they use the kangaroos. Oh, and you can bet that there's new types of dogs and reskins of the dogs out the fucking ass. You know, one of the most annoying fucking enemy types in any of the Souls-likes games. I mean, who doesn't love getting their ass spread apart by 3 fucking dogs as they stun lock block you to death. And I gotta say, the crocodile as the first boss was pretty cool, except for the fact that I have a whole rant about him in the boss section, because he's probably the worst fucking boss in the entire DLC in terms of actual gameplay, because developers in 2025 still don't know how to do camera angles properly. And that's just about it. In an entire fucking zoo, there's like 4 or 5 new enemy types. Are you shitting me? That's what I meant by missed opportunity. You're in a literal zoo. You have such a plethora of options. There's no exotic cats like tigers or lions, cheetahs. There was no reptiles section with giant snakes or anything cool like that. And that's just about it, outside of like a fucking bear or two outside of the zoo, but even then they're just normal ass bears. Who really gives a fuck? But if you're gonna swipe $30 from my pocket like I just dropped a penny at a synagogue, then you could have at least gone above and beyond with the new enemies, especially and again in a fucking zoo. You fight a tiger in fucking Yakuza. And then outside of the zoo, there's a couple new puppets, like the dancer marionettes that look a lot like the twins from Atomic Heart 2 and have cheeks to match. And then the majority of the new enemies are fucking reskins of shit from the base game. Mostly stuff towards the end of the game, like the big enemies with the trench coats and the swords. In my opinion, the enemy variety alone doesn't make this DLC worth $30, let alone the fact that I beat it in about 9 hours? 9 hours for $30 fucking dollars? Especially when, like I said, you could have included a bunch of cool areas in the zoo section alone. On Google, it says this shit might take 15 to 20? Yeah, maybe if you die 50 times to each boss, but I don't know how the fuck it would take you that long. I did pretty much everything this DLC had to offer and beat it in about 9.5. So you get minimal enemy variety, minimal level design, outside of a couple areas, for $30. And like I'm gonna talk about in the next section, quite a few of the bosses aren't that enjoyable either. And while I'm on the topic of side content, I'm not gonna say that the base game had very good side content, considering that basically every side quest was just like talk to a person in a window, go find an item, and then go give it back to them. But it is even more lackluster in the DLC, with there only being about 2 or 3 side quests, if that, off the top of my head. And all they're really there for is just to give you a tidbit of extra lore and function the exact same way as the base game. And honestly, whether the ones in the base game were that good or not, that doesn't mean they couldn't have stepped it up a bit for the DLC. There is one side character that you might be a little more interested in, because from what I've been told, she's a character in the original Pinocchio story, but I'm not gonna sit here and lie and say I've read or am familiar with the original story, so this character didn't mean much to me. But if you are a fan of the original story, then this character might add something extra for you, so I'm not gonna fault the game for my lack of knowledge. But with that being said, the side quests are still extremely lackluster, and they're really not worth talking about that much. And there's really not that much more to say about them. And the final thing I want to talk about before I go into the bosses is that not every fucking regular fodder enemy needs to have a 6 to 8 hit attack combo and kill you in 2 fucking hits. And it's not so much a skill issue or they're too hard, as much as it is just fucking annoying. Especially when you wind up surrounded in gank areas. And this was pretty much one of the same complaints I had about Shadow of the Erdtree. And just like Shadow of the Erdtree, I didn't feel like this was as much of a problem in base Elden Ring or base Lies of P. It's just that these developers feel the need to crank everything to fucking max in these DLCs to the point where it actually takes away from the fun factor and begins to creep into the fuck off factor. And if you are gonna give your enemies high damage, then again, not every enemy needs to have a fucking Millennia Waterfell Dance attack chain, especially if you're gonna throw multiple of these fuckers at me at once. This is the main reason why the gorillas piss me off, because they could eat several hits while simultaneously just being unrelenting in their damage, which just made them an overall chore to fight, which is how I felt about most things in this DLC. One of the biggest enjoyment factors from Souls games for me and a lot of other people is that they're always supposed to feel difficult but fair, and there's usually always a way to make things easier if you you know what you're doing. And again, that's one reason I really like the base game, because I feel like it is really overall fair, and you can beat the majority of bosses after a couple of attempts if you pay close attention to their attack pattern. And the majority of them I feel like are reasonable to attempt in maybe even your first try, outside of maybe a couple of the in-game ones. And I feel like that's the best way I could explain my problem with DLCs like this and Shadow of the Erdtree, is that a lot of these bosses and areas in general just expect you to essentially beat your fucking head against the wall until you perfectly memorize the enemy's attack pattern, with practically zero room for error in between. Most of these new Souls-likes make the old Souls games look fucking easy in comparison. Hell, I replayed Dark Souls 3 not that long ago, and honestly it felt extremely easy after playing Elden Ring in comparison, let alone the first Dark Souls, where, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the difficulty comes from the actual environment itself rather than the actual bosses. And luckily in this game you can parry, which does give you an extra way to defend yourself and counter the enemy, but like I'm going to talk about a bit more on the final boss, a lot of these attack chains are pretty unreasonable for you to parry your first time encountering the enemy. And it really is just starting to feel like every single one of these Souls-likes felt like they have to outdo each other or outdo the last in terms of difficulty, to the point where it's basically become a meme of how many times can you die before you finish the game. I mean, if we continue down this fucking route, 5 to 10 years from now, these enemies are going to be moving at the speed of Dragon Ball characters, and we're basically just going to be chasing the enemy's after image, all while we're still stuck with nothing but a parry and a fucking dodge roll. And I feel like the majority of these dev teams have completely forgotten what made these Souls games fun in the first place. Because it's not beating your head against a brick wall, it's not unreasonable speed and difficulty, it's not how many times I can die before I finish the fucking game, but rather it's about traversing the world, finding interconnecting pathways, finding hidden loot, trying to avoid traps, to eventually work your way to a boss that, while might overall be challenging, ultimately feels fair, and if you do die, you can usually see where you went wrong and where the fault is. And if you don't beat it on the first try, then you can usually beat it on your next two at the very least. But instead of that, they took the "you died" meme too literally. So with that ran out of the fucking way, let's get into the bosses. Because while there were definitely some fun ones, they were also pretty hit and miss at the same time. And fuck the crocodile in particular. So the first boss on our list, and the first major boss that you will be encountering in the game, is the Tyrannical Predator. No, not Vosh.
It is possible for an adult and a child to have a sexual relationship, and for it to have positive outcomes. On the child.
No, this big ass motherfucking crocodile. And I just want to say something right off the bat, that this boss really isn't that hard, and I actually had a huge DSP moment and didn't realize that at the very beginning of the DLC, I actually unequipped my defense gear and had the weakest one on for the entire first section of the DLC, meaning that I was taking way more damage than I should have been. So I'll accept my fault on that, because as long as you don't do something as retarded as that, the boss isn't that bad difficulty and moveset wise. What's dog shit about this fucking boss is the camera. The camera is your worst fucking enemy in this fight. And on top of that, the arena is way too goddamn small for this big ass fucking gator, whose body alone takes up a damn third of it. And another thing that's shit about him is that even if you parry a lot of his attacks, they will still send you flying 8 to 10 feet backwards, usually into the corner of the arena, which then causes the camera to be shoved directly and firmly 3 feet up your asshole, causing you to not be able to see anything except Pinocchio's wooden starfish.
Get that camera the fuck away from me.
I don't know how we're this fucking far into gaming history, and developers still haven't figured out cameras. Either zoom the camera out when you're pinned against the wall, or make the wall become transparent so that the camera doesn't get shoved up inside the character like they're a goddamn meat puppet. But for that alone, I would call this boss quite poorly designed. And either the arena needs to be bigger, or these devs need to figure out how to do camera angles properly. But at least outside of that, this boss isn't that bad. But it's not exactly anything special design-wise either, considering that it's just a big-ass crocodile.
Oh, what is this? Oh, you want some of this? Oh, you brought the whole family. Oh, my dick!
The second major boss you'll be fighting, and on the contrary is actually one of my favorite ones, is Markiona, Puppeteer of Death, who if you've beaten the base game has a device on her hand that might look awfully similar.
I was told that murderous puppet had come to call on me.
What is that in your hand?
It matters not.
What is that?
You belong to me now.
And is actually a pivotal point of the DLC's story, and explains where your dickhead dad gets it in the base game. But like I said, I actually quite enjoyed this boss, and she felt quite reasonable once I realized I had the wrong defense gear equipped and finally changed it. She basically looks like a sexy smurf with Tifa-size equipment, and her whole gimmick is that she can summon a puppet to fight with her, so it's basically a 2v1, but all you actually have to do is defeat her, and it'll automatically shut down the puppet by default. And the only actually complaint I have about this boss is that throughout a lot of the fight, the cock-sucking puppet will attack you from off-screen, which can feel like bullshit sometimes while you're trying to get in some DPS on her openings, and all of a sudden this cocksucker comes in roundhouse kicking you from off-screen, giving you basically no time to react. But luckily it wasn't that bad, and the puppet's attacks, outside of a couple, don't do any unreasonable amounts of damage, so I thought it was a well-designed boss with quite a cool looking arena on top of it, and really was one of the only actual memorable bosses, at least to me, outside of one other one in the final boss, but that one's memorable for wrong reasons.
Fuck out of here.
Up next is Veronica, leader of the Sweepers, and honestly I completely forgot this boss even existed until I saw her on the boss list. And even then I was like, wait, who is that again? And I barely even remember fighting her. I'm pretty sure I killed her like my first or second attempt, so she's really absolutely nothing special despite being the leader or whatever. And she got demoted to leader of making me a sandwich real fucking quick. But she basically just felt like every other stalker fight in this game, kinda just like a Souls-like PvP fight, except she has a jet-powered hammer, which sounds pretty cool, except you don't even get the fucking thing after you beat her, even though it looks exactly like a weapon you would use throughout the game. So I don't know why the fuck they were too lazy to give it to you, or maybe you can find it somewhere else and I just missed it, but I thought that was pretty lame. But yeah, there you go, that's all I have to say about her. Least memorable boss in the DLC by far. And I think it's kind of a goddamn joke that she's considered one of the major bosses.
It's alive. It's alive. It's alive!
That completely forgettable shitty bitch is followed up by the two-faced Overseer, who was that other boss I mentioned just a couple minutes ago that I also enjoyed, along with the sexy Smurf. And not just does he have a badass design looking like something straight out of Frankenstein's laboratory, but he's also equipped with a giant scythe made out of what looks to be junk parts. And outside of his cool design just instantly catching my attention, he had quite a fun and well-designed fight to go along with it, which much like the Puppeteer felt completely fair, and the couple times I did die, I also realized exactly where I went wrong. Notice the trend I'm trying to set here by saying that on the bosses that I enjoyed in particular. And in addition to that, there is also a story-based NPC you can summon for this fight called the Tracker, who provides additional dialogue and also makes this fight quite a bit more fun as it adds to the story on top of it. So luckily this next boss is actually optional, but I still fought him anyways. And I already said most of my thoughts for this boss while ranting about him earlier, but this boss is the Prometamorphic Green Hunter, and I'm pretty sure is just a younger version of the green sludge monster you fight in the base game, given that this DLC is a prequel. But that was one of the worst fucking fights in the base game, and I fucking hate that cocksucking piece of shit. And really, outside of like the Rabbit Brotherhood or whatever the fuck they were called, was like the only boss that I actually thought was shit. And out of all the bosses from the base game, you could have chose to redo in the sequel as like a younger version. You chose this cocksucking, cum-guzzling, garbage-eating piece of shit. Are you kidding me? I hated the boss in the base game, and I hate it just as much here. If anything, it's even a little fucking worse here. But this boss is dog shit and has such a fucking obnoxious attack pattern, along with just doing annoying shit in general. It's really not the hardest boss, but like I said, it's just fucking annoying and can feel cheap at moments. But I have nothing else to say about this waste of ozone layer, so just be happy it's optional, and let's get on to the next one. The next boss up is Anguish, Guardian of the Ruins, and I gotta say, this boss is pretty hit or miss for me, because on one hand, he's got a really badass design and a pretty equally cool arena that's also extremely spacious, so you don't have to worry about getting pinned, and then on the other hand, he's just not that fun to fight gameplay-wise, and tends to suffer from the same issues that a lot of giant bosses suffer from in Souls-like games. But really, it's his whole gimmick is that you can only hit him on his head and his hand, and if you hit the rock on his hand enough, it'll eventually expose a weak point, causing your attacks to do more damage. So you really just want to hit his hand as much as you can. I don't think you can break the hard point on his head. I spent a couple runs just only hitting his head and it never happened, but the one on his hand breaks quite quickly. Really, this boss isn't that hard or anything. He has a couple of annoying attacks, but it's nothing too difficult, and as long as you stay up close to him, a lot of his attacks will just downright miss you or go over you, as well as a lot of his attacks being extremely telegraphed. The main issues with him is that it just requires a lot of fucking running around and chasing him down as you constantly run back and forth to his hand every time he moves it. The camera can get way too close and jank, like the crocodile boss when you're up close to him, trying to avoid his attacks, and he just feels like quite a chore to fight, due to just having quite a big health bar. But I really didn't enjoy this fucker that much. But on the plus side, he is the boss that gives you the gun blade, so that's definitely a pro for him, considering he gives you the coolest weapon in the DLC. But I swear to fucking god, if you Koreans worried half as much about camera angles as you did your motherfucking skincare products, then this wouldn't even remotely be an issue. But that's all I gotta say about this cock. The next flamboyant homo wearing all gold is named Lumaccio, leader of the bastards, and much like Veronica, leader of the sweepers, he is yet another extremely forgettable fight. A slightly less forgettable than Veronica, just due to his all gold outfit, and the fact that when you get him to half health, he chugs a bottle of Red 40 and begins to harness the power of George Droid himself.
I can't breathe!
But really, this boss isn't anything special. Like I said, extremely forgettable, nothing too difficult. He has some annoying status effect bullshit in his second phase, but outside of that, he's just a non-noteworthy boss, barely worth mentioning, and the only thing you get from killing him is his, quite frankly, disgusting ass outfit that I will never be wearing. So with that little backstabbing cunt out of the way, let's talk about the final boss.
What the? Oh my god.
Oh. Okay, that's annoying. Holy shit. Heal? Can I please heal?
Yeah, can you
Yeah.
God damn! Fucking whore!
For combat. What? This shit's pissing me the fuck off. You've literally never done that attack before.
Shit talking, you fucking ass, you're on the side.
Fuck!
Bro, what? Are you fucking... Dude!
I'm dead. I'm done. I'm dead, yeah. Oh my fucking god. Move!
So, or banana and like...
I'm done, dude, I'm done.
Any enemy you wanted.
Oh my, this boss. Holy shit, dude, that boss is... Arlecchino the Blood Artist. I think the only thing I don't hate about this motherfucker is his design, because I gotta admit, he looks pretty badass, and he's overall very visually impressive.
This is exactly what I've been waiting for! This
But in terms of fighting him and actual gameplay, I fucking hate this cocksucker with every goddamn fiber of my being. And I think is overall the perfect representation of what I was talking about earlier, with the whole Souls games going in the wrong direction. And personally, I had more issues with this guy and spent more time fighting him than I did Consort Radon in fucking Shadow of the Erdtree, and I already felt like that guy was a load of horse shit, especially since I fought him on release when a lot of his hitboxes were were way bigger than they were supposed to be. Because every fucking attack this man has, at least in his second phase, is like at a bare minimum 5 fucking swings. When I say 5 swings, I mean 5 really fast fucking swings. He's insanely fast, he's aggressive as all fuck, and all of his openings or any chance to hit him feel like they're about half a second long. Unless he's staggered, of course. But his stagger bar also feels like it takes forever to fill up, at least it did for me, because I had such a hard time trying to figure out the parry pattern for this guy's attacks, because he would constantly switch back and forth in between insanely fast with no pause in between, requiring you to have perfect accuracy and timing on all your button presses, only to then switch it up and throw out a 10-hit combo, but every attack has a very slight Elden Ring delay just before the swing, just completely fucking you in the mind game department. I feel like it's completely unreasonable to expect anybody to beat this boss their first few attempts without having at least seen somebody else fight it beforehand. Now luckily his first phase isn't that bad. The only thing I didn't like about his first phase is he has this one attack where he slashes from left and right repeatedly, and the thing that kind of pissed me off is that the amount of times he swings seems completely random. There were times where he would only swing 3 times, there was times where he would only swing 5 times, then there was times where he'd swing like fucking 20 times in a row. But again, outside of that one attack, his first phase isn't that bad. But then the absolute second he kicks it into his second phase, he immediately does this attack that reminded me of Melania's waterfowl dance, except this time hopped up on fucking fentanyl. And this whole fucking chain of attacks gives you very, very little time to breathe. And if you fuck up on like any part of blocking this long ass combo, then you are basically instantly dead. I had more deaths to this one motherfucking attack than any other by far, and if I could survive that one attack, then getting him to at least half health wasn't that big of a challenge. But god damn, man, learning how to survive that attack was ridiculous. And after watching some other people fight it, it seems like the best plan of attack is to parry dodge, because if you try to just parry all that shit or dodge all that shit, it's not gonna happen. He'll track you across the entire fucking arena to ensure your ass does not escape. Luckily, there's also a story summon you can use for this fight to make it a bit more bearable, and you bet your ass I use that summon. I was gonna use it regardless for my first playthrough just to get the extra story bits, but after spending like 2 hours on this cocksucker, I have no intentions to try and fight him without her. And all those reasons is exactly what I want these newer fucking Souls games to chill the hell out with, because by the time I finally did kill this guy, I didn't have any sense of satisfaction, I wasn't happy, I didn't feel good about myself, I didn't sit there and go, wow, that was a fun challenge. I was exhausted, beat, didn't want to play the game anymore, and just felt like that was such a bullshit fight. All while being a perfect example of artificial difficulty, which is not the feeling these games are supposed to give you, or any video game for that matter, because at the end of the day, the point of video games is to be fun, and the feeling you get after defeating a hard boss should be just that, a feeling of satisfaction, not a fucking migraine as if you just smashed your head against a cement wall for 3.5 hours. And you wanna know one of the worst things about this fucking boss, and is honestly one of the worst things about this DLC in general? The final boss doesn't even drop a boss soul. You do not even get a boss weapon from this guy. And on top of that, there are only 2 boss souls in the entire DLC. Yeah, 2. Luckily, one of them is a really cool gun sword. But really? Fucking 2? Now, you do get a sword after you kill the final boss, but the sword you get doesn't even come from the boss itself. And considering how cool of a design he has, and that's the one compliment I have to give this fight, it was such a damn letdown to not even be able to get at least cool attachment from him. So that was just yet another disappointment on top of the fight, and is overall a complaint I have about this DLC in general, is the fact that there are only 2 boss souls, and again just adds to the list of reasons why I think this DLC is just a $15 Dark Souls DLC in disguise. So with all these damn bosses out of the way, let's get into my one story nitpick and the conclusion. So if you do plan on playing this DLC, and you are interested in the story and don't want any spoilers, then I would skip to the conclusion, because this definitely is a bit of a story spoiler. So this is your one and only warning. So essentially, the basic premise of this plot is that you travel back in time, back before the Awakening, which is, you know, all that shit that destroys the city and everything in the base game. And your main goal is to essentially just help the legendary stalker, Leia, who, of course, the legendary stalker is a woman. This game's made by Korea, currently suffering from the lowest fertility rate in the world, and worshippers of K-pop idols, which are essentially just feminized men wearing makeup.
Look out, faggot!
But she is cute, so I'll at least give them that. But your goal is to help Leia save your friend Romeo, who in the base game is the King of Puppets boss, before he's killed by Arlecchino, the crazy puppet serial killer. And this is the same Arlecchino that you encountered all fucked up and destroyed in the base game after you go through his riddles.
Riddle me this before you go. I am loud and obnoxious. I like music that rhymes. I'm a fraction of the population, but commit half the crimes. Who am I?
Correct! Fantastic insight!
But my only real complaint here is that nothing fucking changes and essentially nothing you do matters, because they basically set this whole time travel thing up as if it's a pre-established time loop, meaning that this essentially always happens and that P was always meant to travel back in time and things were always going to be this way. And that's all fine and dandy if the DLC was bigger and offered more content, but I just see this as a missed opportunity to actually make this DLC worth $30 fucking dollars. If they would have actually made this DLC to where you can actually make decisions or make choices throughout the expansion, which would then in turn affect the story of the base game, not just would that give you new fresh content, which would also be easier to make since you could reuse the levels, but it would also give you a reason to replay the base game as well. Because like I said earlier, this whole DLC really does just feel like a $15 Dark Souls DLC in disguise, and while I don't think it's a piece of shit or anything, it certainly isn't worth half the price of a full game, nor does it have the content to match. And this whole thing with the time travel just feels like a complete missed opportunity, since at the end of the day it means absolutely nothing and there's absolutely nothing you can change. And so before I get into the conclusion, there is just one last thing I want to mention, and that's the addition of the new difficulty settings and why I think this is an issue for any Souls-like game to begin with. And completely outside of the whole mindset of get good, these games honestly shouldn't need a difficulty setting to begin with. Souls-likes in general have never had difficulty settings, and the reason why is because the game is designed and created around a single difficulty level, and by balancing everything according to one difficulty setting, it is way easier for these dev teams to make an optimal difficulty setting, or I guess you could say the way the game is meant to be played, according to the creators themselves. And I would argue that in the majority of these games, the only thing the difficulty slider changes is either how much of a bullet sponge the enemies are, or if you die in 2 hits or not, pretty much. And while I tend to like to play on harder difficulties, simply for the challenge and to get the most out of the game I'm playing, I'm also not going to sit here and say I haven't played plenty of games that are very poorly balanced on their highest difficulty. And really, any well-made Souls game shouldn't need more than the one difficulty intended. A big part of the Souls games is that whenever you died, you usually know where you went wrong and could go in and correct yourself to kill the boss on either your second or third try. Outside of like a couple bosses in the older Souls games, usually people weren't spending several fucking hours fighting Smelter Demon. And really, I feel like this just sets a bad precedent going forward, because I would imagine that means that any Souls game these developers make from now on will also have a difficulty setting, which means that they're now also gonna have to balance the game around 3 difficulty settings, instead of just focusing on one centered gameplay experience the way they were intending. So I do not think it is a good addition by any means. So with that, let's get into the conclusion.
Thank you.
So like I just said throughout this entire video, this really is a $15 DLC in disguise, and I don't think it has the content in any way, shape, or form to be worth $30. Nor do I think the DLC itself is even that good, with only really 2 bosses that actually stood out to me, and that I actually enjoyed and had fun fighting, along with level design and world design that felt like a step down from the base game, including plenty of reused enemy types, and the new ones themselves also being a huge missed opportunity, as well as just not being that fun to fight to begin with. I really couldn't recommend this DLC to anybody until at least a half off sale, if I'm being honest. There was no aspect of this DLC that was really that good, and overall I think this DLC was just slightly above average, if anything, which is why I feel like the perfect score for it is a 6.5. And the only thing giving it a 0.5 is the fact that I enjoyed the weapons from this DLC better than the ones from the base game, mostly just because of the pinwheel sword and the gun sword. So given that I felt like those were an upgrade from the base game, I give it an extra half a point for that. And if you are really interested in playing it for whatever reason, I would wait till, like I said, it's the price of a Dark Souls DLC and a nice $15 or less. So if you enjoyed this review or found it helpful, consider leaving a like and a sub, and a big thanks to this channel's members and Poirlights. Your guys' support means a lot, and it's a great motivator for pushing these reviews out. And with that, I will see you guys next time.